Istanbul, 1789. As the old world trembled under the shadow of revolutions, the Ottoman Empire stood still, its glory fading, its armies weak, its spirit fractured. Then came a new sultan, Selim. Selim III was not like his predecessors. He was not content with inherited traditions or idle ceremonies. Raised among books, music, and the echoes of empire, he believed deeply that the Ottoman world could rise again. He took the throne during one of the most uncertain moments in Ottoman history. The empire had just suffered devastating defeats against Russia and Austria. The once feared Ottoman army had become a shadow of itself, ill-disciplined and outdated. The treasury was drained, the bureaucracy bloated. And worst of all, the janissaries, the empire's elite warriors, had become a corrupt political force rather than a military asset. Selim saw all this, and he was not afraid. Unlike most Ottoman sultans before him, Selim looked to Europe, not just as an enemy, but as a model. He closely followed the reforms of Catherine the Great in Russia, the Prussian military discipline of Frederick the Great, and the cultural awakenings of France. He admired their science, their military structures, and their growing control over the modern world. Selim believed that the Ottomans must either change or perish. So, he chose change. Selim began laying the foundations for what would become known as the Nizam-e-Jadid, or the New Order. The cornerstone of Selim's reforms was the creation of a modern, European-style army. The Janissaries had become unreliable, and Selim knew that any serious transformation had to begin with force, both as protection and symbol. He hired French military advisors, ordered the translation of Western technical manuals, and began constructing new barracks, uniforms, and training academies. The new army was drilled in firearms, artillery, and tactical formations unknown to traditional Ottoman soldiers, but Selim didn't stop there. He established embassies in London, Paris, Vienna, and Berlin, the first permanent diplomatic missions of the empire in Europe. For the first time, Ottoman eyes and ears were present in the capitals that once plotted against them. He reformed the financial system, attempting to fix the corruption within the tax administration. He pushed for improvements in naval power, education, and state governance. At his court, music, poetry, and intellectual discussion flourished. Selim was himself a talented composer, a lover of classical Turkish music, and a poet who wrote under the name Ilhami. But behind the melodies and verse, he was orchestrating something much louder, a revolution from within. To many in the empire, especially the young, the idealists, and the intellectual elite, Selim became a symbol of progress. They saw in him not just a ruler, but a visionary, a man willing to risk his throne to save his people from decline. Foreign observers were cautiously impressed. European ambassadors wrote of Selim's sharp mind, his charm, and his seriousness. Some hoped he might pull the empire back from the edge. Others feared a rising Ottoman power, reborn in a modern form. But not everyone welcomed the new order. Behind the walls of the old palaces and mosques, discontent brewed. The Janissaries saw Selim's new army as a direct threat to their power, and they were right. Religious leaders feared that the reforms were inspired by infidels and would erode Islamic traditions. Corrupt bureaucrats and tax officials felt their positions slipping as Selim's reforms brought scrutiny. Selim knew this. He had grown up in the palace. He understood the whispers of betrayal. But he moved forward anyway. And so, the dream began. A sultan with the heart of a poet and the mind of a general, trying to drag a dying empire into the future. The year was 1792. Sultan Selim III stood at the helm of a bold and fragile experiment. Modernize an empire without breaking it. But change, no matter how necessary, rarely arrives without a price. And in the shadows of Istanbul's domes and minarets, powerful voices were beginning to rise, angry, afraid, and ready to strike. Once the fearsome backbone of the Ottoman military, the Janissaries had become something else entirely. Over generations, their discipline eroded. They no longer marched for glory, they marched for profit. No longer loyal servants of the Sultan, they had become a bloated and corrupt political class, armed and dangerous. Selim's new army, the Nizam-e-Jadid, with its clean uniforms, European drills, and French advisors, was a clear message. The old guard was no longer untouchable. The Janissaries saw it for what it was, a threat, a direct challenge to their power, their wealth, and their identity. They were humiliated, sidelined, and enraged. And when angry soldiers feel abandoned by their emperor, they do not sit quietly. They plot. But it wasn't just the Janissaries. The ulama, the powerful class of Islamic scholars, also grew uneasy. To them, the reforms looked suspiciously like westernization. They feared the erosion of religious authority and the dilution of Islamic tradition. Why were foreign instructors brought into the empire? Why were Western sciences prioritized over religious studies? Why were ambassadors being sent to Christian courts? They began whispering among themselves that the Sultan had strayed from the path of Islam, that his modern army and bureaucratic reforms were opening the doors not to strength, but to corruption. Selim tried to reassure them. He emphasized that his vision was not against religion, but for survival. He sought progress, not abandonment of faith. But whispers, once begun, are hard to silence. And then there was the court itself. The Ottoman palace was a world within a world, full of ambition, envy, and betrayal. Ministers who once praised Selim's reforms began to turn when they saw their influence weaken. High-ranking officials who profited from the old ways resisted changes to tax collection, administration, and land reform. Selim, though intelligent and well-meaning, was not always politically ruthless. He tolerated too many around him who smiled in his presence, but sharpened their daggers in secret. Some said he spent too much time composing music and poetry. Others accused him of losing touch with the streets of Istanbul. And all the while, outside the palace walls, a storm was building. Selim's reforms required funding, new barracks, modern weapons, European advisors, printing presses. These all came with a cost. To pay for it, he introduced new taxes and attempted to cut off the corrupt chains of local tax collectors. But in the provinces, this sparked rebellion. Peasants were overburdened. Local lords resisted interference. Merchants and guilds feared instability. Inflation rose. Trust fell. What began as a dream of reform was now tangled in the brutal realities of statecraft, resistance from the military, the religious elite, the aristocracy, and the common people. Selim was alone at the top of an empire that no longer moved as one. Some warned him. His allies in the bureaucracy whispered of plots. Advisors told him the Janissaries were growing bold again. Even the French ambassador noted the Sultan's growing isolation. But Selim hesitated. Perhaps he still believed reform could be achieved through patience and poetry. Perhaps he thought loyalty would hold. He didn't purge the Janissaries. He didn't exile his enemies. He waited, and so the pressure built, day by day, candle by candle, behind the walls of mosques, barracks, and palaces. In 1707, the spark finally came. A minor military uprising in Istanbul erupted over rumours of being forced into the New Order army. It should have been a small issue, easily contained. But the Janissaries saw their moment. They flooded into the streets. Religious leaders blessed the revolt from the pulpits. Old officials whispered encouragement. Within hours, the city was in chaos. The rebels surrounded the palace, demanding the end of the Nizam-e-Jadid, and the abdication of Selim III. Shockingly, the empire's elite military and guards offered no resistance. Selim had built a new army, but he had not yet given it the strength or the will to protect him. He was forced to abdicate, a poet emperor, dethroned by the very people he tried to save. In his place, they installed Mustafa IV, Selim's cousin, a weak-minded, reactionary figure favoured by the Janissaries and conservative elites. Selim was placed under house arrest. His new order was dismantled. The printing presses were closed. The embassies fell silent. The barracks emptied. His vision shattered like stained glass under a hammer. But history was not finished with Selim. Not yet. In the quiet halls of the Topkapi Palace, behind gilded doors and velvet curtains, the once mighty Sultan Selim III was no longer emperor. He was a prisoner. He did not rage. He did not plead. He wrote poetry, captive of the empire, stripped of power, stripped of hope. Selim spent his days in forced isolation. He was allowed no visitors, no letters, no voice. His beloved instruments, his ney, his tambour, his writing desk, were taken from him. He had been the dreamer of a modern empire. Now, he was a forgotten soul behind palace walls, but even in silence, he remained a symbol. To his enemies, a danger that still breathed. To his allies, a flame not yet extinguished. And one man, one bold, brilliant man, was determined to light that flame again. The rise of Mahmud. In another part of the palace, a younger prince, Mahmud, Selim's distant cousin, watched and waited. Barely 22, Mahmud had witnessed the chaos of Selim's fall. He had seen the mobs, the fires, the fear. But Mahmud was different. He was quiet, observant, and most of all, he was determined not to suffer Selim's fate. As Mustafa IV, the puppet sultan, ruled in name only, Mahmud quietly began building connections. Whispers spread. Some guards were loyal to Mahmud. Some officials missed Selim's order. Some common people still hoped. Mahmud's plan was not yet revolution, it was restoration. Restore Selim, restore order, restore hope. But hope is a dangerous thing in an empire built on fear. The conspiracy. By the summer of 1808, the secret plan to restore Selim was ready. Supporters in the military, especially from the provincial governors and loyal soldiers in the Balkans, were preparing to march on Istanbul. Leading them was an ambitious and powerful general, Alemdar Mustafa Pasha. He had fought under Selim's banner before. He had seen the corruption, the Janissary decay, the failed promises of Mustafa IV. He wanted change. He wanted the new order restored. He wanted Selim III back on the throne. On July 28, 1808, he arrived outside Istanbul's walls with thousands of men. The coup had begun. Inside the palace, panic erupted. Mustafa IV realized his time was up. He knew if Selim was restored, his life and rule would end. He ordered the unthinkable: kill Selim, kill Mahmud, leave no heirs. The orders went to a group of palace guards, trusted assassins. They rushed to Selim's chamber first. He did not resist. He stood with dignity, unarmed. And there, in the dim candlelight of his prison room, Sultan Selim III, poet, reformer, dreamer, was stabbed to death. He died silently, like a broken promise. But Mahmud escaped. As the assassins approached, a servant loyal to Mahmud led him through the secret corridors of the harem. He climbed rooftops. He ran barefoot across marble tiles. He leapt across palace terraces. The guards gave chase, but they were too late. Mahmud found refuge among Alemdar Mustafa's arriving forces. He was declared Sultan Mahmud II that very day. Mustafa IV was overthrown, imprisoned, and, soon after, executed. The Janissaries had tried to kill the future. Instead, they had only postponed it. Legacy of the fallen Selim never saw the empire he dreamed of. He never walked in the new schools he built, never commanded the army he envisioned, never received the letters from Paris and Vienna he longed for. But his death was not in vain. Mahmud II would go on to crush the Janissaries, forever ending their centuries-long grip on the throne. He would bring radical reform. He would finish what Selim started. And in doing so, he would whisper the name of the cousin who once sang to the stars, Selim the poet, Selim the gentle, Selim the betrayed. He ruled with vision. He reigned with hope. He died without justice. But his story lives on, not as the Sultan who failed, but as the man who dared to dream too early. Some men are born before their time, Mahmud once said. My cousin was one of them.